Every single time you try to use willpower to finish a difficult task, you are you're biologically programming yourself to fail.
Yeah, that sounds completely backward.
It really does, because, I mean, we've all been conditioned to believe that self-control is just this ultimate virtue, right? Like if you just grit your teeth and dig deep to force yourself to study or work out or, learn a new language, you'll eventually succeed.
Right. Just push through the pain.
Exactly. But the actual underlying architecture of your brain actively punishes you for trying too hard in that specific way. Relying on sheer grit is, it's essentially a structural design flaw in how we approach our own goals.
It's a profound mismatch between our cultural narrative about hard work and the actual, neurobiology of human behavior. We constantly treat the brain like this perfect, obedient machine.
Like a computer.
Yeah, exactly like a computer. You input the command like, I am going to study for 3 hours, and you just expect the output. But human cognition isn't binary like that. It's this wildly complex and, honestly, often contradictory ecosystem.
Which makes total sense when you look at how rarely we actually succeed with those brute force methods. I mean, think about your own life listening to this right now. You have goals. You have this idealized future version of yourself who, speaks 3 languages, never misses a workout, reads a book a week.
The perfect version of you.
Right. And you buy all the productivity planners, you set the 5 a.m. alarms, you download all the habit trackers, and
you still end up scrolling on your phone at 11 p.m.
Yes. It's incredibly frustrating. But today, we're going to dismantle that frustration completely. We are looking at a set of sources today that provide a literal blueprint for bypassing willpower entirely.
And I have to say, the source material is highly unusual for this topic. We aren't analyzing, newly published neuroscience textbook or some Silicon Valley productivity manifesto.
No, not at all. We're actually looking at a transcript that was originally created for advanced C2 level English listening practice.
No, it's meant to be a language tool.
Exactly. Just 2 speakers demonstrating high-level vocabulary, nuanced prosody, complex sentence structures. But the content of their dialogue is this hidden gem. It is a rigorous, scientifically backed masterclass on the psychology of self-discipline.
They're using behavioral psychology merely as the vehicle for language practice, but the actual insights they drop are just staggering.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can start engineering better habits, we really need to look at the hardware first. Why is discipline such an uphill battle to begin with?
Well, to get to the root of that, we have to look at how the transcript actually defines self-discipline. It's framed as the capacity to regulate behavior, emotions, and impulses for long-term objectives despite short-term temptation.
Which, sounds simple enough on paper.
On paper, sure. But neurologically, it describes an active war zone. When you try to sit down and do something difficult, you are triggering a biological tug-of-war between 2 very distinct brain regions, the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system.
Okay, right. I always think of the prefrontal cortex as the brain's executive suite. Like, it handles the logic, the forward thinking, the long-term strategic planning.
Precisely.
It's the part of you that mathematically understands that studying Mandarin today will yield a massive career benefit, say, 5 years from now.
And that executive suite is a relatively recent evolutionary development for us. It's highly sophisticated, but it is also incredibly energy intensive. It requires a tremendous amount of metabolic resources, specifically glucose, just to operate effectively.
Okay.
And then, sharing that exact same skull, you have the limbic system.
Which is the ancient hardware.
Very ancient. The limbic system is primitive, it's instinctive, and it's driven almost entirely by immediate emotional gratification and the avoidance of discomfort.
So it just wants to feel good right now.
Exactly. In an evolutionary context, the limbic system is what kept us alive. If you found high-calorie sugar in the Pleistocene era, your limbic system didn't want you to save it for next year. It demanded you consume it immediately.
And today, I guess that translates into craving the immediate dopamine hit of, like, a social media feed rather than the delayed gratification of studying.
You hit the nail on the head.
Okay, let me see if I can map an analogy onto this to see if I'm tracking the dynamic. It sounds like the brain is essentially a workplace where you have this hyper-rational, strict manager, the prefrontal cortex, who is holding a 5-year strategic plan.
I like this.
But this manager is forced to share a tiny office with a toddler who has zero concept of the future and just wants to eat candy and watch cartoons right this very second. And that toddler is the limbic system.
That is a brilliant analogy, and that toddler analogy scales even further when you consider the power dynamic in that office.
Oh, so?
Well, the toddler is louder, faster, and requires almost zero energy to throw a tantrum. The manager, on the other hand, gets exhausted trying to reason with it. What's fascinating here is that the source text zeroes in on this exact paradox.
Which paradox?
That we intellectually know what's good for us, the manager knows the plan, but the actual execution requires the manager to actively and continuously suppress the toddler.
And that suppression is basically what we call willpower.
Yes, exactly. And as the transcript points out, attempting to win this biological tug of war through pure, unadulterated willpower is just an unsustainable strategy.
Because the manager gets tired.
Right. You are relying on a highly metabolically expensive brain region to constantly police a deeply ingrained, highly efficient survival mechanism. The toddler will eventually win simply by outlasting the manager.
Which honestly is a massive relief to hear.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it completely strips away the moral judgment.
Yeah.
Like failing to stick to a habit isn't because you are inherently lazy or lack character.
Sure.
It's because you are bringing a spreadsheet to a toddler tantrum. It's an unwinnable fight.
It really is.
So, okay, if we accept that we cannot just bully our own limbic system into submission, we have to find a way to bypass the toddler entirely. We have to lower the drawbridge so quietly that the limbic system doesn't even realize we're sneaking a difficult task into the castle.
And the source approaches this bypass through a concept of terms incremental initiation.
Incremental initiation.
Right.
Which sounds incredibly academic, but the mechanics of it are brilliantly submersive. The text advocates for starting with actions that are so trivially small that they barely register as effort.
Yes.
So instead of declaring you are going to study for a massive 2-hour block, which is basically a declaration of war against the limbic system, you commit to studying for exactly 5 minutes.
This targets a specific psychological barrier known as activation energy.
What exactly is that?
In behavioral science, activation energy is the cognitive friction that exists between a state of rest and a state of action. The higher the perceived effort of the task, the greater that cognitive friction is.
Oh, I see.
So a 2-hour study session requires a massive spike in activation energy. The prefrontal cortex has to muster a huge amount of regulatory power to overcome the limbic system's immediate instinctive rejection of that idea.
It's the mental equivalent of trying to push a giant boulder up a hill from a dead stop.
Exactly.
But by reducing the commitment to just 5 minutes, you are shrinking the boulder down to a pebble. The friction essentially evaporates.
And that evaporation of friction is vital because of how the brain categorizes tasks. The basal ganglia, which plays a massive role in habit formation and routine behaviors, loves predictable, low-effort patterns.
Okay.
When you make the task 5 minutes, the prefrontal cortex doesn't have to fight a massive battle. It can easily slip that tiny task past the limbic system's defenses.
But wait, let me push back on this a bit on behalf of the ambitious listener who is trying to achieve something genuinely difficult. If my goal is to, pass the bar exam, or learn a complex coding language, 5 minutes of daily study is objectively not enough time to master that material. Am I actually making real progress, or am I just tricking myself into feeling productive while fundamentally moving at a glacial pace?
It's a completely logical concern, especially if you are evaluating the process based solely on immediate output. But that fundamentally misunderstands the actual architecture of habit formation.
How so?
Well, the source text makes a critical distinction here. In the nascent stages of behavioral change, the actual output, like how many lines of code you write or how many vocabulary words you memorize in those 5 minutes, is entirely secondary.
Really? Then what's the primary objective?
Establishing the neural pathway of the routine itself.
Because right now, that pathway doesn't even exist. The brain doesn't have a default setting for studying at 7 p.m.
Exactly. You are laying down the initial wiring. Once the behavioral groove is established through that low-friction daily repetition, the source notes that escalating the intensity later becomes exponentially easier.
Get it.
You don't have to fight the toddler to start anymore because starting has become a normalized, non-threatening baseline. You are optimizing for the habit of starting, not the habit of finishing.
You're pouring the concrete foundation before you worry about building the skyscraper. I love that.
It's a great way to look at it.
But it does introduce a logistical problem, right? Lowering the activation energy to 5 minutes is great. It removes the mental block. But our lives are chaotic.
Very true.
How do we ensure that this trivially small task doesn't just get lost in the noise of emails and errands and exhaustion, Because saying I'll do my 5 minutes today usually translates to realizing at midnight that you completely forgot.
The source recognizes that vague intentions are the absolute enemy of execution. Relying on "I'll do it later" places a continuous low-grade cognitive tax on the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, because you're always thinking about it.
Right. You are constantly forcing your brain to evaluate, is now the right time? What about now is now good? This brings us to a concept called implementation intentions.
Which is a term the transcript specifically pulls from the research of psychologist Peter Gollwitzer, right?
Yes, exactly.
And Gollwitzer's research essentially proved that vague aspirations are biologically prone to failure. Like saying, I will read more, isn't a plan, it's a wish.
It is a wish that totally lacks a triggering mechanism. Gollwitzer's extensive studies demonstrated that goal attainment skyrockets when individuals predecide the exact parameters of their behavior.
Okay, give me an example.
The source text provides a stellar one. Quote, I will review 20 advanced vocabulary items immediately after my morning coffee while seated at my desk.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's dissect the anatomy of that sentence because it is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah.
I will review 20 advanced vocabulary items. So that's the specific low activation energy task.
Right.
Immediately after my morning coffee. That is the temporal trigger. While seated at my desk. That is the spatial anchor. You are creating this highly specific cue behavior linkage.
And this linkage operates on the principle of situational cues. You are taking a fragile, newly forming behavior reviewing the vocabulary, and you are grafting it onto a deeply entrenched, robust habit that you already perform automatically.
Which in this case is drinking your morning coffee.
Exactly. You are hijacking an existing neural superhighway to carry your new fragile habit.
That is so smart. It operates almost exactly like programming and automation in a smart home.
How do you mean?
Well, you set a rule, like if the front door unlocks, then turn on the hallway lights. The system doesn't debate whether or not to turn on the lights. It doesn't use willpower. The trigger simply fires the action.
I love that comparison.
Right. By setting an implementation intention, you are basically writing an if-then algorithm for your own basal ganglia. If coffee is finished, then initiate vocabulary review.
That algorithmic approach is exactly what makes it so incredibly effective. As the transcript notes, you are completely removing the human decision-making element from the moment of execution.
Because decision-making is what drains the manager.
Yes. You don't have to decide to study. The completion of the coffee dictates the behavior. You are offloading the regulatory burden from your conscious, exhaustible prefrontal cortex onto your environment and your existing routines.
It ceases to be a choice and just becomes an automated sequence.
Perfectly said.
Which is brilliant. We've outsmarted the limbic system with a tiny task, and we've programmed our brain's algorithm to trigger the task automatically.
Oh.
But, and there's always a but, what happens when the physical world around us refuses to cooperate?
The environment.
Yeah. Let's say the algorithm fires. You finish your coffee, you sit at your desk to do your 5 minutes, and immediately your phone lights up with a news alert, your smartwatch buzzes with a text, and you have 14 unread emails staring at you on the monitor.
This is where the source delivers one of its most critical insights, and it really challenges a deeply held misconception about human capability. The text explicitly states that willpower is a finite, depletable cognitive resource.
Which is a staggering paradigm shift. It means willpower isn't a muscle that you can just flex infinitely if you try hard enough. It's more like a battery.
Yes. The psychology community often refers to this as ego depletion. The idea that self-control draws upon a limited pool of mental resources.
So it literally drains you.
Right. While there is ongoing debate about the exact metabolic mechanisms of ego depletion, the behavioral reality, which our source text heavily relies upon, is undeniable. Resisting temptation carries a cognitive cost.
Every single time.
Every single time. Every time you actively ignore a buzzing phone, every time you suppress the urge to check social media, your prefrontal cortex is expending energy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it fundamentally recontextualizes all of our failures. If you get to the end of the day and you skip your workout or you abandon your studies to binge watch television, it's not because you had a sudden collapse of moral character.
No, not at all.
Your willpower battery is just as 0% because you spent the entire day fighting off micro distractions in your environment.
Precisely. You were operating in a hostile environment that demanded constant suppression of the limbic system. The source argues that relying on self-control to navigate a distraction-rich environment is a mathematically doomed strategy.
Because the battery will always run out.
Your battery will always drain before the day is over. So the alternative it proposes is environmental architecture.
Environmental architecture. I like the sound of that. Stop trying to be a hero and start being an architect.
Exactly. If the phone is on the desk, even if it's face down, your brain is actively burning glucose just to maintain the boundary of not picking it up. The limbic system knows it's there.
Oh, it absolutely knows it's there.
And it really wants the dopamine hit that the phone provides. So the architectural solution isn't to stare at the phone and bravely resist it.
Or is it then?
The solution, as outlined in the transcript's dialogue, is to physically remove the temptation. One of the speakers specifically mentions leaving the phone in an entirely different room during their non-negotiable study blocks.
They also talk about using website blockers, right, to physically lock themselves out of distracting sites. And creating a dedicated spatial zone that only signals focus.
Yes, spatial zones are huge.
Like, if you only ever read complex material in a specific chair, eventually the mere act of sitting in that chair cues your brain to enter a state of concentration. You're basically outsourcing your discipline to your environment.
By engineering the environment, you are artificially lowering the necessity for willpower. You don't need to expend cognitive energy resisting your phone if your phone is physically inaccessible.
Right, you can't check what isn't there.
Exactly. Motivation is incredibly fickle. It fluctuates with your blood sugar, your sleep quality, your mood. But a heavily engineered environment remains structurally sound regardless of how motivated you feel.
Okay, let's take a step back and look at the system we've built so far, because this is getting good. We have an impenetrable, architecturally designed environment. We have our smart home if-then triggers set up, and we are only demanding 5 minutes of effort to bypass the brain's friction.
It's a solid setup.
The setup is flawless. But I know what you, the listener, might be thinking right now. Okay, 5 minutes of easy, automated study in a quiet room is nice, but how does that actually translate into elite-level mastery?
It's a fair question.
Right. We really need to understand the underlying math and biology of how these tiny drops actually fill an ocean.
And the source addresses this through the concept of the compound effect. The core argument here is about prioritizing consistency over intensity.
Consistency over intensity.
Yes, that modest, daily, incremental progress invariably surpasses sporadic bursts of intensive effort.
Which flies in the face of how most of us operated in, say, high school or college. I mean, we worship the weekend warrior mentality.
Oh, completely.
We ignore a subject for 6 days and then subject ourselves to an 8-hour marathon study session on Sunday, fueled entirely by panic and caffeine.
But the text provides a striking mathematical counter to that marathon approach. It highlights the principle that improving by merely 1% every day compounds to being 37 times better over the course of a single year.
Just a 1% improvement.
Just 1%.
That is almost microscopic. You wouldn't even notice a 1% improvement day to day.
You really wouldn't.
But because it's compounding, because the Tuesday's 1% builds upon the brand new baseline established on Monday, the growth curve eventually just goes vertical. Over 365 days, you aren't 365% better, you are 37 times better.
The mathematics of it are incontrovertible. However, the text grounds this math in actual neurobiology by introducing a term, synaptic permanence.
Synaptic permanence, okay.
This is the biological mechanism that explains why the 1% compound effect is mandatory for true learning, and why that sporadic intensity, the cramming, fails.
Let's dive deep into that then. What is physically happening in the brain when we consistently do that 5-minute task every single day?
Well, it relies on a foundational rule of neuroplasticity, often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together.
I've heard that phrase.
Yeah, it's a common one. When you learn a new vocabulary word or practice a new chord on a guitar, your brain forms a synaptic connection. However, that initial connection is incredibly weak.
It's like walking through a dense forest.
How so?
The first time you push through the underbrush, you might bend a few branches and leave a faint trail. But if you don't walk that exact path again for a week, the forest just reclaims it. The trail disappears.
That is an excellent analogy, and that is exactly what happens with sporadic, intensive effort. The brain is highly efficient, so it engages in something called synaptic pruning.
Pruning, so it actively cuts things away.
Exactly. If a neural pathway isn't utilized frequently, the brain assumes the information is irrelevant and prunes the connection to save energy. But when you engage in that consistent daily 5-minute practice, you are walking that trail every single day.
And biologically, the brain starts to pay that trail, right? It wraps those specific neural connections in something. Myelin.
Myelin, yes. Myelination is the key to all of this. Myelin is a fatty substance that acts as an insulator around the nerve fibers. Every single time you fire that specific pathway, the brain adds another layer of myelin.
So it builds up over time.
Right, and this insulation dramatically increases the speed and efficiency of the electrical signals. What started as a faint trail through the forest becomes a paved road, and eventually a high-speed, frictionless superhighway.
And that superhighway is what we're calling synaptic permanence.
Exactly. That robust, heavily myelinated pathway is synaptic permanence.
So what does this all mean for the classic cramming before a deadline strategy? I mean, you stay up all night, you force feed your prefrontal cortex an entire textbook, and you manage to regurgitate it for the exam the next morning. It feels like learning. But biologically, is it?
Biologically, cramming is a mirage.
A mirage.
It is. It temporarily sensitizes the receptors, which allows for that short-term recall you need for the test. But because the exposure is isolated and not repeated over time, myelination never occurs.
So the trail never gets paved.
Right. The brain quickly categorizes that massive data dump as biologically irrelevant and just prunes it. The forest grows back almost immediately.
That explains so much about college.
Right. If the goal is actual mastery, lifelong retention of a skill or language consistency is literally the only biological pathway available.
You cannot cheat neurobiology. You have to build the myelin day by day. But okay, here's the final hurdle.
There's another one.
Yeah, because knowing that we need to do this every day for a year to build that superhighway is incredibly daunting. Even a 5-minute task can start to feel like a chore by, say, day 40.
That's true. Habit fatigue is real.
The novelty wears off, the limbic system gets bored, and that friction we talked about starts to creep back in. How do we keep the brain engaged for the long haul?
Well, we have to give the brain what it fundamentally craves. Dopamine.
Dopamine, the reward chemical.
Exactly. The source text explores this through the lens of operant conditioning and strategic reinforcement.
Right. In the dialogue section of the transcript, one of the speakers specifically mentions that they're successfully leveraging something called the Premack principle.
Yes. The Premack principle, which was formulated by psychologist David Premack, dictates that a more probable behavior can be used to reinforce a less probable behavior.
Okay, let me translate that into human terms to make sure I've got it.
Go for it.
A less probable behavior is the high-friction task you are trying to turn into a habit, like reviewing complex coding syntax. Left to your own devices, the probability of you spontaneously choosing to do that is quite low.
Very low.
Right. And a more probable behavior is something you naturally enjoy and will almost certainly do without any prompting at all, like drinking a premium cup of coffee or watching an episode of your favorite show.
Exactly. You got the definitions perfectly.
Okay, so how do we combine them?
The principle suggests that if you strategically sequence these behaviors, if you strictly allow yourself the highly desirable activity only immediately after the completion of the difficult task, you fundamentally alter the brain's relationship with the difficult task.
And the source text gives some really great grounded examples of this. Speaker B in the transcript institutes a hard rule. After their non-negotiable 30-minute Mandarin block, and only after they permit themselves to watch an episode of a Chinese drama they are hooked on.
It is a perfect closed-loop system of strategic reinforcement. However, the text emphasizes a critical parameter for this to work on a neurobiological level.
What's the catch?
The reward must be immediate.
Immediate. Why is that immediacy so vital? Like, if I study hard on Monday, why can't my reward be going to a movie on Friday?
It comes down to the temporal dynamics of the dopaminergic pathway.
Okay, break that down for me.
So dopamine is not merely a pleasure chemical, which is how it's often portrayed. It is actually the brain's primary mechanism for learning and reward prediction.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. When you receive that immediate reward, the coffee or the TV show dopamine spikes. That spike serves as a neurological tag. It literally looks backward in time and tells the brain whatever actions immediately preceded this dopamine release were highly valuable. Wire those actions in and do them again.
Oh. But if the reward is delayed by 4 days, the dopamine spike has absolutely no idea what behavior it's supposed to be tagging.
Exactly. The neurological connection is completely lost. The brain cannot bridge that massive temporal gap. It has to be contiguous.
Okay, I understand the chemistry of it, but I have to challenge the philosophy behind this a little bit.
Sure.
If I'm setting up a system where I basically have to bribe myself with a television show just to sit down and learn something, aren't I just treating myself like a lab rat pressing a lever for a pellet?
It can definitely feel that way.
Right. It feels highly manipulative. Will I ever develop a genuine intrinsic pattern passion for the subject, or will I always just be chasing the pellet?
It's an excellent critique, and it really cuts to the core of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
But the brilliant thing about the neurobiology here, which is implicitly addressed in the source, is that the system evolves over time.
It evolves.
Yes. Initially, you are entirely extrinsically motivated. You are pressing the lever for the pellet. The dopamine release is tied exclusively to the television show.
Right. The steadying is just the toll I have to pay to get to the reward.
But as you engage in this loop consistently, something profound occurs in the brain. It's known as a reward prediction error.
A reward prediction error.
Yes. The brain is basically an anticipation machine. Eventually, the dopamine release begins to shift backward in time.
Backward.
Yeah. It stops waiting for the television show, and it starts spiking when you sit down at your desk. It spikes when you open the textbook. The dopamine becomes associated with the pursuit itself.
Oh, wow. So the brain starts rewarding you just for executing the routine.
Yes. The feeling of competence, the recognition of your own growing mastery, the friction-free execution of an automated habit, these all become intrinsically rewarding. The behavior becomes, as the transcript eloquently states, identity integrated.
Identity integrated. I love that.
You no longer require the external bribe because the act of studying has become fundamentally who you are and what you do. It generates its own dopamine.
That is the holy grail right there. Moving from extrinsic bribery to intrinsic identity.
It really is.
I mean, we started this deep dive looking at a broken machine. We were looking at a biological paradox where our grand intentions were constantly sabotaged by our own internal hardware.
The toddler versus the manager.
Exactly. But by dissecting this unusual source material, we've essentially uncovered the developer's manual for the human brain.
We have certainly delineated a highly systemic, biologically found methodology that entirely bypasses the need for raw willpower.
Let's tie all these threads together because the architecture we've built today is just incredibly powerful.
Let's do it.
First, we stopped going to war with our limbic system. We recognize that the inner toddler will always outlast the manager if we fight head-on. So we outsmart it. We lower the activation energy, using incremental initiation to shrink the task down to 5 minutes, completely bypassing the brain's resistance to effort.
And once that barrier is lowered, we establish our implementation intentions. We graft our new behaviors onto existing spatial and temporal anchors. If I finish my coffee, then I sit at my desk.
The smart home algorithm.
Right. We transform abstract goals into automated algorithmic sequences that require zero daily decision-making.
And then we protect that fragile sequence by engineering our environment. We accept the hard truth that willpower is a finite, easily depleted battery, and we remove the digital and physical temptations, so we never have to spend our precious glucose resisting them.
We protect the battery.
Exactly. Next, we trust the inexorable math of the compound effect, prioritizing daily, microscopic consistency over sporadic intensity, knowing that we are physically myelinating the neural superhighways of synaptic permanence.
And finally, we sustain that daily consistency by hacking our own dopaminergic pathways. We utilize the Premack principle, immediately reinforcing the difficult task with a high probability reward until the dopamine shifts backward and the behavior itself becomes an identity-integrated source of intrinsic satisfaction.
It is a phenomenal framework, and the absolute best part for you listening right now is that this entire system is completely modular.
Highly modular.
You don't need to buy a software suite or hire a productivity consultant. You can take these exact parameters and apply them tomorrow morning to whatever massive undertaking you're trying to conquer.
Just apply the formula.
Right. It removes the paralyzing dread of information overload or imposter syndrome because you are no longer focused on the insurmountable peak of the mountain. You're only focused on the environmental triggers of your next 5-minute step.
It is a framework that truly reclaims agency from biology. However, analyzing the conclusion of our source text reveals a rather profound, almost philosophical implication regarding the ultimate endpoint of this whole journey.
Oh, I love a good paradox. What does the text suggest?
Well, the source notes that through the meticulous long-term application of these principles, the environmental engineering, the compounding myelination, the intrinsic dopamine shifts, the arduous task eventually requires absolutely no conscious deliberation.
Right, because it's automated.
Exactly. It becomes almost automatic. You are executing complex behaviors effortlessly because they are deeply identity integrated, which leads to a really fascinating thought experiment.
Lay it on me.
If the ultimate application of perfect self-discipline eventually makes the difficult behavior completely automatic and utterly frictionless, does that mean the true goal of mastering self-discipline is actually to make self-discipline entirely obsolete?
That completely shatters the paradigm. We spend all this time trying to build the perfect discipline machine, only to realize the ultimate victory is never having to turn it on at all.
It's a pretty wild thought.
That is an incredible thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, take a look at your environment, lower that drawbridge, and start paving your superhighway.
I want you to picture a very specific but like incredibly universal moment.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Think back to 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Eve. Just really picture who you are in that exact minute.
Oh, wow, right. The peak of optimism.
Exactly. You are standing there, maybe holding a glass of champagne, you're looking at the clock ticking down, and you are just absolutely vibrating with conviction.
Yeah, you've made the promise.
Right. You've made a promise to yourself, like you're going to learn Spanish this year, or you're finally going to write that novel,
Right.
or get to the gym 4 days a week without fail.
And the thing is, in that moment, the desire isn't fake at all.
No, not at all. It's not a superficial wish. You genuinely, deeply feel the truth of that commitment right in your bones.
Yeah, it's a really powerful feeling, like that rush of anticipatory triumph.
It really is. But then, fast forward just 2 weeks.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's January 14th. It's like a rainy Tuesday evening.
Yeah.
You've had a completely brutal day at work.
We all know that Tuesday.
Yeah, right. And where are you? You're sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television, eating potato chips directly out of the bag, and your Spanish textbook is buried somewhere at the bottom of your backpack.
Completely untouched, of course.
Completely untouched. And you're just sitting there wondering, like, what on earth happened to the person I was 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, why can't I just do the thing I desperately want to do?
Exactly. That abrupt transition from ultimate conviction to, well, total behavioral collapse is arguably the most frustrating human experience there is.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's universal.
And it is exactly what we are deconstructing today. So welcome to the deep dive.
I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. Today, we're taking an absolute microscope to the psychology, the neuroscience, and the practical day-to-day architecture of self-discipline.
We're looking at how to actually build it, maintain it, and, survive when it inevitably falters.
Right. And if you're listening to this feeling like you're the only one who struggles to stick to a routine, believe me, you're going to want to hear what we've uncovered.
Because the source material we're using for this exploration is actually, well, it's incredibly unique.
Yeah, it is. We've been analyzing the notes, the transcripts, and the entire curriculum structure of an advanced English learning program.
Which, I'll admit, sounds like a very strange place to look for psychological insights.
I know. When I first saw the stack of sources, I honestly thought we'd be doing a deep dive on, like, verb conjugations and dangling modifiers.
You definitely expect that.
Yeah.
But this particular curriculum, it actually uses the topic of mastering self-discipline as its central vehicle for teaching advanced language skills.
It's so clever.
It really is. The creators built these highly immersive dialogues about goal setting and behavioral psychology.
And in the process of just teaching vocabulary, they inadvertently created an absolute masterclass in behavioral science and metacognition and habit formation.
Yeah, the linguistic structure they use happens to carry some of the most profound, empirically validated psychological insights available right now.
It's basically like a Trojan horse of incredible behavioral architecture.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And our mission today is to take those hidden insights and essentially rescue you from the exhausting, never-ending cycle of relying on heroic willpower.
Because that cycle just burns you out.
Completely. We want to shortcut you to becoming effortlessly well-informed on how to actually stick to your goals using intelligent system design.
Because let's face it, the cliche advice we've all been given our entire lives, the whole just try harder lecture.
Oh, I hate that lecture. Or just be more disciplined.
Right. It doesn't work. It has never worked.
No. So we are moving way beyond that today to look at the actual neuromechanisms of human behavior. Okay, let's unpack this. When we look at that New Year's Eve scenario, what is actually happening in the brain?
Well, we have to start by putting a name to that specific frustration.
Okay, what do they call it?
In the psychological literature, that phenomenon is known as the intention-action gap.
The intention-action gap. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's that vast, seemingly unbridgeable chasm between what we sincerely intend to do and what we actually end up executing in reality.
Basically the gap between 11:59 p.m. and January 14th.
Yes, exactly. And the data our sources pull from is staggering when you really look at it.
Hit me with the numbers.
Studies consistently indicate that approximately 40 to 50% of all New Year's resolutions fail within the very first month.
Wait, 40 to 50%? In the first
In less than 30 days. Let that sink in for a second. Nearly half of all those intense, deeply felt promises we make to ourselves just completely dissolve.
Wow. That is a wildly sobering statistic.
It really paints a picture of human struggle, doesn't it?
It does. But I have to admit, in a weird way, it's also deeply validating.
How so?
Well, if you've ever failed at a goal, it means you're not uniquely broken. You don't have some, rare character flaw. You're just participating in a 40 to 50% statistical norm.
Oh, totally. It's just human nature.
Right. But the lingering question is why? Why do we fail despite having the best, most sincere intentions? Because, like we established, the desire isn't fake.
The person genuinely wants to learn the language.
Yeah, the desire is entirely real, so what goes wrong?
The failure happens because almost all of us operate under a massive, culturally ingrained misconception about how human drive actually functions.
A misconception? Like what?
We've been sold a myth, and that myth is the deeply held belief that motivation must precede action.
Motivation has to come first.
Right. We fundamentally believe that we need to feel like doing something before we can actually initiate the behavior.
Oh, guilty. I do that all the time.
We just sit around waiting for inspiration to strike. We wait for the energy to arrive. We wait to feel motivated.
I do that constantly. If I have a heavy writing assignment, I'll organize my desk, I'll make a cup of tea, I'll read an article, all under the guise of, getting into the right headspace.
The classic procrastination rituals.
Yes. I'm literally waiting for the motivation fairy to tap me on the shoulder so I can start.
And that is the exact trap. What's fascinating here is the scientific research consistently demonstrates that the causality is entirely reversed.
Reversed? What do you mean?
Action generates motivation far more reliably than motivation generates action.
Wait, really? Action comes first?
Yes. The mere act of commencing a task, even if you are doing it without a single ounce of enthusiasm, typically produces sufficient psychological engagement to sustain your continuation of that task.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on this because it sounds like a paradox to me.
Sure, let's break it down.
If I am not motivated, if my motivation tank is completely on zero and I'm sitting there actively dreading my language study session, how do I take action?
Well,
Are you saying I just have to force it? Because if there's no fuel, how does the engine start?
I see what you're saying. You're thinking of motivation as the fuel that starts the engine.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's actually the momentum that keeps the vehicle moving.
Yeah.
Think of it less like the gas in the tank and more like, the kinetic energy of an object that's already in motion.
Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I'm tracking this correctly.
Go for it.
Let's say you have a stalled car with a manual transmission.
Okay.
The battery is completely dead. You don't just sit in the driver's seat waiting for the car to magically feel motivated to start, right?
Right. Because the battery is dead.
Exactly. So you have to physically get out, put your hands on the trunk, and push this heavy, stubborn piece of machinery down the street.
Which is awful.
It's exhausting. It feels entirely forced, and you hate every second of it. But once you get it rolling, once you create that initial physical action and build a little speed, you can pop the clutch.
And the engine turns over.
Yeah. Suddenly the car is powering itself. So you have to push the car to start the engine. You can't wait for the engine to start so it can push the car.
That is brilliant. That perfectly encapsulates what scientists refer to as overcoming activation energy barriers.
Activation energy. I remember that from chemistry class.
Yeah, if we look at chemistry, activation energy is the minimum amount of energy required to initiate a chemical reaction. Like a match doesn't just burst into flames on its own.
Right. It needs the initial friction of being struck against the box.
Exactly. That friction is the activation energy. And once the reaction starts, it sustains itself and produces its own heat.
Ah, I see.
So in human behavior, what we mistakenly label as a lack of motivation is actually just us standing at the bottom of a high activation energy barrier.
So when I'm looking at my textbook and thinking, I'm just not motivated to study for an hour today, I'm misdiagnosing the problem completely.
Totally misdiagnosing it.
The problem isn't a lack of mystical internal drive. The problem is that the barrier to entry, the idea of sitting down, opening the book, struggling with foreign grammar, and focusing my mind for a whole hour it's simply too high for my current exhausted energy state.
Yes, you're looking at the top of the mountain instead of the very first step.
So how do I fix that?
If you lower the barrier, say, by making an agreement with yourself to just push the car 3 feet, or agreeing to sit at the desk and open the textbook for just 2 minutes, the initial action happens.
And then the magic happens.
Right. Once you are physically in motion, the brain's engagement pathways start to light up. The enthusiasm and the focus, the engine turning over, it follows the action.
Action is the spark, not the result.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes profound logical sense. But it naturally leads to a really difficult question.
Which is?
If action has to come before motivation, then what is powering that initial spark? Like, what gives us the strength to strike the match or to push that stalled car, even those first few agonizing feet when we really, really don't want to?
That's the million-dollar question.
For decades, the self-help industry and the scientific community just called that willpower, right? We've always treated it like a muscle that gets tired or a battery that drains. So is that initial push just raw, depletable willpower?
Well, this is where the science has evolved significantly in recent years, and our source curriculum highlights this shift beautifully.
Oh, really? How so?
Historically, the dominant theory in psychology was something called ego depletion. This was a massive, highly influential concept championed largely by a prominent psychologist named Roy Baumeister back in the late 1990s.
Ego depletion. I've definitely heard of that. That's the battery analogy, right?
It is. Baumeister's hypothesis was that self-control and willpower draw from a limited, finite, biological reservoir of mental resources.
Like a tank of gas in your brain.
Right. And to prove this, he ran a famous experiment that is just fascinating to look back on.
Okay, lay it on me.
He brought hungry college students into a room that smelled incredibly strongly of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies.
Oh, it's just cruel. You know they were starving.
It gets worse. He put a plate of those warm, fresh cookies right on the table, right next to a bowl of raw radishes.
Raw radishes. That's a terrible trade.
Yeah. And he told half the students they were only allowed to eat the radishes, and they had to actively resist the cookies.
Oh my gosh.
The other half, though, were allowed to eat the cookies.
Okay, lucky them.
So after this agonizing period of resisting temptation, he took both groups and gave them a spatial puzzle to solve.
Let me guess. It was a really hard puzzle.
Even better. What he didn't tell them was that the puzzle was mathematically impossible to solve.
That is diabolical. Why would he do that?
He just wanted to see how long they would keep trying before they completely gave up.
Wow. Okay, so what happened? I'm assuming the people who had to eat the radishes gave up faster.
Significantly faster. The students who ate the cookies and didn't have to use any willpower worked on the impossible puzzle for an average of about 19 minutes.
Okay, 19 minutes. And the radish group.
The students who had to burn their willpower resisting the cookies while eating radishes, they gave up after just 8 minutes.
Wow. Less than half the time.
Exactly. So Baumeister concluded that resisting the cookies had depleted their finite reserve of self-control. Their ego was depleted.
And honestly, that feels incredibly true to our daily lived experience, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like, decision fatigue is a very real sensation. By 8:00 p.m., after a full day of making choices at work, regulating my emotions in traffic, and, resisting the urge to snap at people,
You're just done.
I am so done. I don't want to make another choice. I don't want to exercise willpower. I just want to sit on the couch. So Baumeister's theory makes intuitive sense.
It does make intuitive sense.
But you said the science has evolved. Did that radish study not hold up?
Well, it started to show cracks. When other researchers tried to replicate those ego depletion studies, the results were wildly inconsistent.
Well, inconsistent. How?
Sometimes they saw the depletion effect, and sometimes they just didn't see it at all.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, this led researchers to look much deeper, moving away from the idea of a biological gas tank and toward a psychological concept called metacognition.
Metacognition. Okay, let's define that for the listener really quick.
Metacognition is, quite simply, our awareness and understanding of our own thought processes. It's our beliefs about our own cognitive capacities.
Basically, it's thinking about how we think.
Exactly. Thinking about thinking.
Okay, so how does thinking about how we think relate to eating radishes and running out of willpower?
A researcher named Veronica Job led some really groundbreaking studies around 2010 that completely flipped the ego depletion model on its head.
Oh, wow. What'd she do?
She suspected that willpower wasn't dictated by biology at all, but by belief. So she categorized people into two groups.
Okay, what were the groups?
Those who believed willpower was a finite resource that drains like a battery, and those who believed willpower was an abundant, self-generating resource.
Like an emotion that can be sparked at any time.
Exactly. And the results were fascinating.
What did she find?
She found that the ego depletion effect, that drop in performance after a difficult task, it only happened to the people who believed willpower was finite.
Wait, really? Only the people who believed in the battery theory ran out of energy?
Yes. The individuals who conceptualized willpower as an unlimited resource demonstrated significantly greater persistence on difficult tasks, regardless of how many exhausting choices they had made earlier in the day.
That is mind-blowing.
They didn't experience ego depletion at all.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if I'm understanding the implication of this research correctly, the willpower tank is only empty because you believe the tank is empty.
That's the exact takeaway.
It's the difference between treating your mental energy like a smartphone battery that inevitably drains from 100% to 1% as the day goes on, versus treating it like a physical muscle.
I like that analogy.
Think about when you're working out. When your muscle starts burning and feeling deeply fatigued during a heavy lift, you often aren't actually at absolute physical failure.
Right, your body still has reserves.
Your brain is generating the sensation of pain and fatigue to tell you to stop. It's a protective mechanism to keep you safe and conserve energy. But if you have the right mindset, you can push through that burning sensation for several more reps because the physical capacity is still biologically there.
Yeah.
Your brain's narrative is creating the limitation, not your actual biology.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The way you consciously frame your own fatigue literally dictates how your brain performs.
That's wild.
The implications of Veronica Job's research are profound for anyone trying to build self-discipline.
I can imagine.
Because if your metacognitive belief at 8:00 p.m. is, I've had a really hard day, my willpower battery is at 0, I literally cannot study, your brain will dutifully shut down your capacity for self-regulation to align with that belief.
It will manifest the exhaustion you expect.
Perfectly said. It manifests it. But if your internal belief is, my mental focus is like a muscle, it warms up and gets stronger as I use it, and I can generate energy by taking action, your brain will access hidden reserves of persistence you didn't even know you had.
So the very first biological step toward unshakable discipline isn't about, like, drinking more caffeine or downloading a new productivity app to track your habits.
No, not at all.
It's an internal psychological shift. It's actively rewriting our internal narrative. We have to tell ourselves a fundamentally different story about what our brains are capable of enduring.
It is a completely different paradigm for understanding human endurance.
Belief dictates capacity.
Okay, I love this. I really do. But let's be fiercely realistic here for a minute.
Let's do it.
Let's ground this in everyday life. Even if I possess the mindset of infinite willpower, and even if my metacognitive beliefs are perfectly aligned with this abundant mindset, I am still human.
Or y'all are.
Every single person listening to this is human. And humans eventually slip up.
Without fail.
You get the flu, you have a massive family emergency, or you just have a moment of profound weakness and make a bad choice. Perfection is a total myth.
Complete myth.
So the real test of self-discipline isn't whether or not you can maintain an unbroken streak of perfection forever. It's how our brain processes the inevitable failure when the failure actually occurs. That is the absolute crux of long-term adherence. It's rarely the initial slip-up that ruins a goal. It's almost always the cognitive cascade that follows the slip-up.
The cognitive cascade. What do the sources say about that?
The curriculum sources point to one of the most dangerous, insidious psychological traps in human behavior. The abstinence violation effect.
The abstinence violation effect. The sources also referred to it by its colloquial name, which I think is much more descriptive.
Which is?
The what the hell effect.
Yes. It is remarkably accurate phrasing, isn't it?
It really is.
The abstinence violation effect was originally studied by researchers like Alan Marlett and Judith Gordon, mostly in the context of addiction and relapse.
Oh, okay.
They were trying to understand why someone who had been sober for months would have one single drink, and instead of just stopping there and recommitting to sobriety the next day, they would spiral into a massive multi-day binge.
That's a tragic pattern.
It is. They discovered a cognitive distortion where a single minor lapse in an absolute rule triggers a catastrophic, complete abandonment of the overarching goal.
Let me give you the most classic, universal, everyday example of this to show how it applies beyond addiction.
Please do.
The classic diet slip-up. You know the one.
Oh, I definitely know the one.
You've been eating perfectly healthy for 2 straight weeks. You are feeling great. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon at the office, someone brings in a box of fresh bakery cookies.
The ultimate test.
Right. You're stressed, you have a moment of weakness, and you eat one single cookie. Now, in the grand mathematical scheme of your biological health and caloric intake over a month, one cookie is entirely irrelevant.
Right. It barely registers biologically.
But what does your brain scream at you? Your brain screams, well, the streak is broken, the diet is completely ruined, what the hell?
There's the phrase.
And because the diet is ruined, you proceed to eat the entire sleeve of cookies, you order a massive pizza for dinner, and you just abandon the entire health initiative for the next 6 months.
It's a tragic comedy of the human brain. That cognitive distortion transforms a minor, mathematically insignificant setback into a total behavioral derailment.
It's so frustrating.
And you see the exact same thing in language learning or skill acquisition. A student studies for 30 days straight, then gets tied up at work and misses one single day.
And their brain just gives up.
Exactly. Their brain concludes, I've already failed, my perfect streak is gone, so why bother continuing? It's an intense, all-or-nothing binary thinking pattern that weaponizes our own desire for perfection against us.
If we can't be flawless, we choose to be entirely self-destructive.
Exactly that.
So how do we stop the what the hell effect? Because I know from personal experience that once that train starts rolling in my head, once I've had that one cookie, it is incredibly hard to apply the brakes.
It's like a runaway train.
It really is. The source material highlighted 2 specific antidotes to this cognitive distortion.
They did. The first antidote draws heavily on the work of Carol Dweck.
Ah, the growth mindset researcher.
Yes, the renowned psychologist at Stanford who pioneered that concept. When it comes to self-discipline, applying a growth mindset means fundamentally changing how you interpret a failure.
How so?
It's the practice of viewing lapses not as definitive failures and definitely not as character indictments, but as vital, emotionally neutral diagnostic data points.
Diagnostic data points. I really like that framing. It's like treating yourself and your habits like a science experiment instead of a moral feeling.
Exactly. Let's look at the cookie example again. When you eat the cookie or when you miss the language study session, a fixed mindset reacts emotionally.
I am lazy. I have no discipline. I'm a failure.
Right. It attacks your identity.
Yeah.
A growth mindset, however, reacts with curiosity.
Interesting. What specific environmental or emotional factors precipitated that lapse?
Exactly. I realized I tried to study at 9 p.m. when I was already exhausted from meetings, and my textbook was buried in my backpack, so the activation energy was too high.
The system failed, not my character.
Yes. You use the failure to refine your approach for the next day.
Which perfectly leads into the second antidote they discussed, which is the research by Dr. Kristen Neff on self-compassion.
Oh, this is crucial.
This is all about responding to our own setbacks with warmth and kindness rather than harsh, punitive self-criticism.
Right.
But I really want to push back on this for a second.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because in our culture, especially in high performance, corporate, or athletic circles, self-criticism is practically worshipped.
It's seen as a badge of honor.
It's viewed as the engine of success. We are taught from a very young age that to be great, you have to be incredibly hard on yourself. Doesn't self-compassion just let us off the hook too easily?
That's what a lot of people think.
If I miss my goal and I just look in the mirror and say, oh, well, it's okay, be kind to yourself, isn't that just a recipe for continuous complacency and mediocrity?
It's a very fair question.
Sure.
And it represents one of the most common misconceptions about behavioral psychology today.
Misconception.
Yes. We falsely equate self-compassion with lowering our standards or just letting ourselves slide.
But the psychological and biological data tells the exact opposite story.
Really? How so?
We have bought into this myth that discipline requires constant painful struggle and relentless self-flagellation. But think about what happens biologically when you harshly criticize yourself.
I usually just feel awful.
Right. Because it induces a massive stress response. It triggers the amygdala. It floods your system with cortisol. You feel deep shame.
Yeah, that tracks.
And when human beings experience stress and shame, what is our natural evolutionary response?
We seek comfort.
We look for a way to soothe the negative emotion. And where do we typically seek comfort?
Oh, wow. Usually in the exact bad habits we are trying to break.
Exactly.
Wow. So by beating yourself up for eating the cookie, you generate so much psychological distress and shame that you literally drive yourself back into the arms of the bad habit because you need the dopamine hit of the junk food to provide emotional relief from your own internal bullying.
It's a vicious cycle. You are triggering the exact behavior you're trying to stop.
You've nailed the physiological loop perfectly. Beating yourself up is chemically and biologically counterproductive.
That is wild.
Kristen F's research demonstrates clearly that individuals who practice self-compassion, who speak to themselves the way they would speak to a good friend who just made a mistake, recover from lapses much more quickly.
They bounce back faster.
Yes, and they maintain far better long-term adherence to their goals. Kindness doesn't lower your standards. It simply removes the intense emotional friction that prevents you from getting back on track.
It clears the air, basically.
Right. It allows you to process that diagnostic data we talk about without the blinding, paralyzing fog of shame.
That is a massive paradigm shift, using kindness not just because it's a nice feel-good emotion, but as a hardcore pragmatic utility for maintaining momentum.
A pragmatic utility. I love that.
Yeah. But, okay, let's pivot here. If beating ourselves up doesn't work, and we know we need to rely on intelligent system design rather than raw willpower, how do we actually outsmart our own brains before we even encounter these temptations?
Setting up the environment.
Right. How do we engineer our daily lives so we don't have to constantly deploy this metacognition and self-compassion in the first place? I want to make the good choice the easy choice.
This brings us into the realm of advanced behavioral engineering. The source curriculum details two incredibly powerful external frameworks for this.
What are they?
Temptation bundling and commitment devices. Let's start with temptation bundling. This is a concept extensively researched and popularized by Catherine Milkman, a behavioral economist at the Wharton School.
Temptation bundling. I'll be honest, it sounds like something a marketing executive invented to sell candy bars at the checkout aisle.
It does sound a bit corporate, doesn't it?
What exactly is the mechanics of it?
It's actually a brilliant, scientifically validated way of hijacking your brain's existing neurological reward circuitry.
Hijacking our brains. I'm listening.
Temptation bundling involves taking a task that requires a high degree of self-discipline, something you know you should do for your long-term benefit, but constantly avoid, and deliberately pairing it with an immediately pleasurable experience that you naturally crave.
Can you walk us through one of Milkman's studies on this? How did she prove it works?
No, the gym study is a great example. She took a group of university staff and students who wanted to exercise more, but just couldn't seem to make it to the gym.
A very common problem.
Very common. She gave them iPods. This was a few years ago, obviously.
Retro, nice.
Loaded with highly addictive audiobooks. Things like The Hunger Games or gripping, thrilling mysteries. But here was the catch.
There's always a catch.
The participants were only allowed to listen to these gripping audiobooks while they were physically at the gym exercising.
Oh, wow.
If they wanted to know what happened in the next chapter, they had to get on the treadmill.
So they tethered the immediate craving for the story to the long-term chore of working out. And it worked.
It worked incredibly well. Gym attendance skyrocketed. Because the brain wants dopamine. It wants the immediate reward. By coupling the difficult task with the immediate reward, the brain begins to associate the challenging activity with the positive chemical release.
The English learning curriculum we reviewed provided a really vivid, everyday example of this, too.
Yes, the coffee example.
Right. The speaker in the dialogue was trying to maintain their Portuguese listening practice. They knew they needed to do it, but it felt like a heavy chore, so they created a strict personal rule.
Only during coffee.
Exactly. They were only allowed to drink their favorite, expensive, artisanal morning coffee while they were actively doing the language listening practice. No Portuguese, no fancy coffee. I think the exact phrasing they used in the transcript was, "You are weaponizing your own pleasure-seeking tendencies."
That phrase perfectly captures the essence of Milkman's research. You are recognizing that your brain is fundamentally wired for short-term gratification.
We really are.
Evolutionarily, we are terrible at prioritizing long-term benefits, like fluency or cardiovascular health. We want the coffee or the story right now.
Instantly.
Temptation bundling bridges that gap. Eventually, the anticipation of the delicious coffee bleeds into the anticipation of the study session. You trick your brain into looking forward to the hard work.
It's basically like tricking your inner toddler. You want the candy, fine, but you have to eat the broccoli at the exact same time.
Exactly. The pleasure of the candy masks the chore of the broccoli.
But I can see a flaw here.
What's the flaw?
What about when temptation bundling isn't enough? Because let's be honest, sometimes, even if I have my artisanal coffee waiting for me, the couch still looks way too comfortable.
It happened.
I could easily just decide to cheat, make the coffee, and drink it while watching TV instead of studying. The bundle falls apart because, at the end of the day, I am the one enforcing my own rules, and I am highly susceptible to bribery.
And that vulnerability is exactly where the second advanced strategy comes into play: commitment devices.
Commitment devices. Tell me about those.
This is a concept championed by behavioral economists like Dan O'Reilly. If temptation bundling is the carrot, commitment devices are the locked door.
The locked door. That sounds intense.
A commitment device is a preemptive action you take in the present, when you are feeling motivated and rational, that severely and tangibly constrains your future behavior when you know you will be weak.
How does that work in practice? Walk me through what a commitment device actually looks like.
They can range from very simple environmental constraints to highly complex external contracts. A simple environmental commitment device is recognizing that you have a severe weakness for scrolling social media when you should be working.
Don't we all?
So before you even begin work, while you are in a clear state of mind, you physically delete the apps from your phone, or you install software that completely blocks those websites for 4 hours.
You remove the option?
Yes, you take the choice completely off the table. But Ariely studies even more extreme versions, particularly financial commitment contracts.
Oh boy. Financial contracts.
There are websites now where you can pledge to achieve a goal, say logging 5 hours of steady time a week. You give the platform $500 of your own money.
$500.
If you fail to meet your specified objective, verified by a third party, you permanently forfeit that money.
That is terrifying.
And here is the kicker. Often, you can set it up so that if you fail, your money is automatically donated to an anti-charity.
An anti-charity, what is that?
A political cause or organization that you fundamentally despise.
Oh, that is aggressive.
It works, though.
The idea of my hard-earned money going to a cause I hate just because I skipped studying?
Yeah.
That would absolutely get me out of bed.
It creates a massive immediate consequence.
But let's dig into the psychology here. Why is burning the ships and locking yourself in so much more effective than just trying to muster up the discipline in the moment?
The underlying psychology relies on understanding what behavioral economists call the hot-cold empathy gap.
Hot-cold empathy gap. Okay.
When we are in a cold state, when we are rested, calm, and thinking about our future goals, we are highly rational.
We make great plans.
But when we enter a hot state, when we are exhausted, stressed, or facing immediate temptation, our brain chemistry shifts entirely. We become rationalizing machines.
Oh, I am the king of rationalizing.
If we leave a window of opportunity open, our hot state brain will invent a profoundly convincing, flawless-sounding excuse for why we should skip our habit just this once.
I worked so hard today, I deserve a break. I'll study twice as long tomorrow. We've all heard that voice.
Exactly. Commitment devices work because they remove the decision point entirely before the hot state even arrives.
You can't rationalize if the door is locked.
By preemptively constraining our behavior when we are in that rational cold state, we eliminate the future window where rationalization, decision fatigue, and procrastination breed. You do not have to use a single ounce of willpower to resist social media at 3:00 p.m. if the app literally does not exist on your device.
You've outsourced the discipline to the environment.
Sure.
You are essentially protecting your future self from your future self. I love that. These external hacks, the temptation bundling to hijack dopamine, and the commitment devices to lock out rationalization, they are brilliant structural solutions.
They're incredibly effective tools.
But as I think about this, they are still external. They are tricks we play on ourselves. They are scaffolding. And scaffolding is meant to be temporary. To truly master self-discipline over the span of a lifetime, to make it effortless, it seems like we have to go much deeper. We have to change the internal source code of who we fundamentally are.
That is the ultimate transition. External scaffolding is necessary to build the building, but true, effortless behavioral permanence requires a shift in our core identity.
And the source materials heavily emphasize two profound frameworks for achieving this.
Yes. James Clear's concept of identity-based habits and Charles Duhigg's concept of keystone habits.
Let's start with James Clear, the author of the massive bestseller Atomic Habits. The crucial shift he talks about is moving from goal-oriented thinking to identity-based thinking. Break down the psychological difference between those two approaches for the listener.
Goal-oriented thinking is how almost all of us are taught to operate from childhood. It is focused entirely on the outcome, the destination.
I want to achieve fluency in Spanish. I want to lose 20 pounds.
Right. I want to write a book. The problem with goal-oriented thinking is that the behavior you are doing to reach the goal is perceived by the brain as an obstacle. It's a chore you have to get through to get the reward.
Right, the studying is just the annoying toll I have to pay to get to fluency.
Precisely. Identity-based thinking, however, abandons the destination and focuses entirely on the type of person you wish to become.
How does that sound in practice?
Instead of saying, I want to achieve fluency, the internal narrative shifts to, I am someone who studies languages daily. Instead of, I want to run a marathon, the identity becomes, I am a runner. Instead of, I want to write a book, it's, I am a writer.
Okay, I can hear a skeptical listener thinking, so what? That just sounds like semantics. It's a slight tweak in vocabulary, like a cheesy daily affirmation.
A lot of people dismiss it as just semantics.
Does changing those few words in your head really alter human behavior that drastically?
It alters it fundamentally because it taps into one of the most powerful drivers of human behavior, cognitive consistency pressures.
Cognitive consistency pressures. What does that mean?
Human beings have a deep-seated, psychologically ingrained need for our actions to align with our internal self-image. When there is a mismatch between what we do and who we believe we are, we experience cognitive dissonance, which is a state of severe psychological discomfort.
Oh, I hate cognitive dissonance. So how does that play out with a habit?
If your goal is just an external outcome, I want to learn Spanish, skipping a day of studying doesn't threaten your core identity. It just delays your goals slightly. You can live with that.
Yeah, I just say, I'll do it tomorrow.
But if your deeply held internalized identity is, I am a dedicated language learner, then skipping a day creates intense psychological friction. You are acting out of alignment with who you believe you are. To resolve that uncomfortable dissonance, your brain will actually push you to do the habit.
I really want to emphasize the linguistic reframing here because the speaker in our source dialogue nailed this feeling perfectly.
They really did.
They said that once they successfully shifted their identity, doing the daily practice no longer felt like an external imposition. Instead, it felt like an authentic expression of who I am.
That phrase is so powerful.
That is a staggering difference in lived experience. If I'm just trying to reach a goal, the daily work feels like a tax. But if I am a writer, then writing isn't a chore. It is just the authentic expression of my existence. A writer writes. A runner runs. It removes the heavy lifting of willpower entirely because you aren't forcing yourself to do something. You are just acting out your nature.
That's the holy grail of habit formation. Every time you write a page or study a flashcard, James Clear says you are casting a vote for the type of person you want to become.
Casting a vote. I like that.
Once the identity is adopted and solidified by enough votes, the desired behavior actually becomes the path of least resistance. And this identity shift ties directly into the second structural concept here, Charles Duhigg's keystone habits, which he wrote about in The Power of Habit.
Keystone habits. A keystone is the wedge-shaped stone at the very top of a masonry arch that locks all the other stones in position, right? If you remove the keystone, the whole arch collapses. So how does that apply to our daily routines?
Duhigg defines keystone habits as pivotal foundational behaviors that, once established, trigger a cascading sequence of seemingly unrelated positive changes across multiple domains of your life.
Give me a tangible example. If I want to trigger this cascade, what kind of habit are we talking about?
The most universally recognized, empirically proven keystone habit is regular, rigorous physical exercise.
Exercise, of course.
Researchers like Megan Oten and Ken Cheng conducted fascinating studies on this in 2006. They took people who didn't exercise and put them on a 2-month workout program.
Okay, pretty standard.
They didn't tell them to change anything else in their lives, just the exercise. But as the participants established the habit of going to the gym, something incredible happened. They inexplicably started eating healthier diets.
Well, that makes sense. They're working out.
But it went further. They started procrastinating less at work. They showed more patience with their families. They washed their dishes earlier in the day. They even used their credit cards less and saved more money.
Wait, going for a jog made them better at personal finance. That sounds like magic. The exercise itself didn't teach them financial literacy or emotional regulation. So why does doing bicep curls or running on a treadmill magically make you better at managing your stress or eating your vegetables?
It isn't magic. It is biology. To understand why keystone habits work, we have to look closely at neuroplasticity.
How the brain changes itself.
Yes. When you practice a difficult keystone habit, you are not merely learning a specific isolated skill. You aren't just learning how to lift a dumbbell, you are actively, physically strengthening the prefrontal cortex, the area of your brain responsible for executive function, impulse control, and delayed gratification.
So you are literally changing the physical structure of your brain.
Yes, neural pathways that fire together, wire together. Every single time you successfully execute that keystone habit, every time you force yourself to go to the gym when you don't want to, you are upgrading the foundational hardware of your brain's self-regulation system.
Building the willpower muscle.
You are increasing the gray matter density in the areas that control discipline. You build this generalized neural infrastructure of willpower, which you can then apply to any other area of your life.
Wow.
For the language learners in our source material, establishing a rigorous, non-negotiable daily study routine acts as that exact same kind of keystone. It disciplines the mind, and that discipline spills over into everything else.
You are basically installing more RAM in your brain's computer. The hardware is upgraded, so suddenly all the other software programs, your diet, your finances, your emotional control, they just run smoother.
That's a perfect technical analogy.
Okay, let's take stock of where we are. We have built an incredible internal fortress so far. We've shifted our identity from goals to core beliefs. We've established keystone habits that are actively rewiring our prefrontal cortex.
This is a solid foundation.
That is a beautiful, elegant system when life is calm and predictable. But let's invite chaos back into the room, because the identity of, I am a person who studies Portuguese for an hour every morning, is going to get absolutely shattered the minute you have a sick kid.
Or a massive project deadline at work.
Or your car breaks down, or you get the flu. Life is messy. How do we protect this fragile new identity when our perfect optimized routine is completely impossible to execute?
That is the ultimate stress test of any behavioral system. Anyone can be disciplined on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The true measure of a system is how it handles chaos.
So what's the solution?
And the solution our sources provide lies in pairing a concept called minimal viable practice with the renowned research of psychologist Peter Gollwitzer on implementation intentions.
Let's define minimal viable practice first. It sounds like terminology borrowed directly from the tech startup world, like a minimal viable product, the simplest version of an app you can launch.
It's exactly that principle applied to human behavior. Minimal viable practice is the process of establishing an absolute baseline threshold for your habit. A version of the habit that is so small, so reduced, that it is maintainable even under the most adverse, chaotic, exhausting circumstances imaginable.
So it's the bare minimum.
It's the floor of your behavior, not the ceiling.
Give me an example of what that looks like in the context of the language learners from our curriculum. If my ideal perfect world habit is 45 minutes of deep, focused study with my artisanal coffee, my minimal viable practice might be just reviewing 10 flashcards while I'm standing at the sink brushing my teeth.
Exactly. Or doing a single 2-minute audio lesson while walking from your car to the office. Something so embarrassingly small that you can accomplish it even on the absolute worst day of your year.
But practically speaking, I have to ask, what is the actual point of doing that? Reviewing 10 flashcards isn't going to make me fluent. The marginal educational benefit of a 2-minute session approaches absolute zero. It feels almost useless, like you're just humoring yourself.
Educationally, you are absolutely right. The vocabulary retention from a 2-minute session might be negligible, but psychologically, the benefit is monumental.
Psychologically?
The goal of minimal viable practice isn't educational progression, it is psychological preservation. You are preserving the streak, and more importantly, you are preserving the identity structure we just talked about.
Oh, I see. It ties back to James Clear.
Precisely. Remember, if your deeply held identity is, I am someone who studies daily, skipping a day entirely fractures that identity.
It creates that cognitive dissonance.
It creates dissonance and immediately invites the what the hell effect to take over. But doing just 2 minutes of study, even terribly, proves to your brain that you are still that person, even in a crisis. You cast the vote for your identity.
Even if it's a small vote.
Keeping the pilot light on is infinitely more important than the amount of heat it generates that specific day, because it prevents the complete catastrophic dissolution of the habit that usually follows a temporary disruption.
That makes total sense. You aren't trying to win the game that day. You're just trying not to forfeit the season. You are protecting the asset. Now, how do we automate this response to chaos? You mentioned Peter Gollwitzer and implementation intentions. That sounds very clinical and academic.
It is a clinical term, but it represents one of the most empirically validated, highly replicated techniques in all of behavioral psychology.
High praise. What did he discover?
Goldbitzer discovered that people usually fail at their goals because their plans are too vague. He found that by creating precise, highly specific if-then plans, individuals could increase their goal achievement rates by 2 to 3-fold.
2 to 3 times, just by formatting a thought as an if-then statement. That sounds like you're writing basic computer code.
It is entirely analogous to coding. You are literally programming your own behavioral algorithm. An implementation intention takes a vague, abstract desire and anchors it to a specific, unavoidable situational trigger.
Give me an example of the difference.
Instead of saying something useless like, I will try to study more after work, which requires a daily decision and burns willpower, you create a rigid mathematical formula. If situation X arises, then I will immediately perform response Y.
The source material we reviewed had a great practical example of this. One of the speakers realized their biggest behavioral vulnerability was the intense decision fatigue they felt after coming home from a long day at the office.
That dangerous moment of walking through the door.
Yes. They would walk in exhausted, sit on the couch just for a minute, and inevitably succumb to passive entertainment for the rest of the night. So they programmed an implementation intention. If I enter my apartment after work, then I will immediately activate my language learning software before removing my jacket.
Notice the structural elegance of that plan. The trigger entering the apartment is a physical action that is completely unavoidable. You have to come home.
You can't avoid it.
And the sequence is immediate and physically concrete, activating the software before even taking off the jacket. By establishing this rule in advance, in a cold state, the person bypasses the entire deliberative phase.
They don't have to choose.
They do not have to stand in the hallway and ask themselves, am I too tired to study today, or should I watch TV first? The decision was already made weeks ago. Abstract desires are transformed into concrete, automated actions that execute themselves.
It's brilliant because it removes the negotiation. But what about when we are trying to stop doing something bad rather than start doing something good? The sources also mention something called negative implementation intentions or replacement strategies for dealing with active temptations.
Yes, this addresses the reality of sudden urges. A negative implementation intention anticipates the temptation and pre-programs a pivot. It sounds like this. If I feel the sudden urge to check social media while I'm studying, then I will do one extra practice exercise instead.
Let me push back on that, though. Isn't that overcomplicating things? Why do we need a complex replacement strategy for a bad habit? If I tell myself I want to check my phone, shouldn't I just use my willpower and tell myself, no, don't look at your phone?
Because simple suppression, just telling yourself no, almost inevitably backfires due to a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as ironic process theory.
Ironic process theory.
This was famously researched by Daniel Wegner in 1987 and is more commonly known as the white bear phenomenon.
Ah, right. I know this one. If I tell you, whatever you do for the next 10 seconds, absolutely do not think about a white bear, what is the very first thing that vividly pops into your head?
A white bear. Because in order to ensure you aren't thinking about the white bear, your brain has to subconsciously monitor your thoughts to check for the presence of the white bear, which ironically keeps the concept of the white bear highly accessible and actively running in the background of your mind.
It's a cruel trick of the brain. The more you suppress a thought or an urge, the stronger and more persistent it becomes. It rebounds. So telling yourself, don't check social media, just focuses your entire cognitive load on the concept of social media until you eventually cave.
Exactly. So the negative implementation intention, if I want to check my phone, then I will do one extra exercise, works, because it provides an immediate, pre-planned alternative pathway for that mental energy.
You give the energy somewhere to go.
You aren't suppressing the urge. You are judo flipping it. You are taking the momentum of the distraction and redirecting it into a productive action. You transform the temptation itself into the trigger for the desired behavior.
That is incredibly clever. Okay, so if we take a step back and look at what we've built in this deep dive so far, it is a remarkably robust system.
It's very comprehensive.
We've debunked the motivation myth, proving that action must precede feeling. We've reshaped our metacognitive beliefs about willpower being an abundant resource. We are using the growth mindset and self-compassion to recover from failures without the cortisol spike of shame.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've implemented temptation bundling and commitment devices to engineer our external environment. We've shifted our core identity and built keystone habits to rewire the gray matter of our prefrontal cortex. And we've bulletproofed our chaotic days with minimal viable practices and algorithmic if-then statements.
A literal internal fortress.
It feels like an impenetrable internal fortress of self-discipline. But here's the stark reality. We do not exist in a vacuum. We do not live in isolation chambers. We live in a world surrounded by other people with families, coworkers, and friends.
Real world.
What about the outside world? Does all this intricate internal work hold up if the people around us are chaotic, unmotivated, and undisciplined?
That is the final and perhaps most overlooked piece of the behavioral puzzle. The social architecture of discipline.
The social architecture.
We have a strong cultural tendency to view self-regulation as a deeply solitary, individualistic endeavor. We view it as a solo battle. It's me against my own mind.
Right, the lone wolf mentality.
But network science and sociology clearly demonstrate that behaviors, both highly disciplined ones and deeply self-destructive ones, are remarkably contagious within social networks.
Contagious? You mean like a biological virus?
Functionally, yes. The source curriculum cites a mind-blowing data point from the famous Framingham Heart study to illustrate this.
The Framingham study? I've heard of that.
The Framingham study is one of the most comprehensive health studies in history. Researchers Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler tracked the health, habits, and incredibly detailed social networks of over 5,000 people over the course of 32 years.
That is a massive data set. What did they find regarding social contagion?
They analyzed how obesity spread through these social networks over 3 decades. And what they found was that if a mutual friend of yours becomes obese, your own personal risk of becoming obese increases by 57%.
57%. That is a massive statistical jump just from a friend gaining weight.
It is massive. And the most startling, profound part of their findings is that this 57% increase holds true even if that specific friend lives hundreds of miles away from you.
Wait, really? So it's not just that you're going to the same local restaurants and eating the same large pizzas together?
Exactly. It isn't just about sharing physical proximity or sharing meals. It is about the subtle, invisible shifting of social norms. What you perceive as acceptable, baseline, normal behavior fundamentally alters based on the actions and attitudes of the people in your broader social network.
So it changes your internal compass.
If your friends, even distant ones, are adopting certain habits, it shifts your internal compass of what is acceptable for yourself.
I am just reacting to that 57% statistic, drawing out the sheer magnitude of social influence because it is terrifying, honestly. It completely changes the analogy of self-improvement. As we said, we think of willpower as a solo sport, like weightlifting in a basement. But it is actually an environmental condition.
An environmental condition? That's good.
You are constantly breathing the secondhand smoke of your friends' habits. If your social circle's constantly complaining, skipping their commitments, rationalizing their failures, and making excuses, you inevitably inhale that mindset.
You can't help it.
The psychological barrier for you to skip your own language study or your own gym session lowers dramatically because the social cost of failure among your peers is zero. In fact, failure and complaining become the shared norm.
The secondhand smoke of your friends' habits is a profoundly accurate, evocative way to describe social contagion. And if we connect this all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation, back to the chemistry concept of activation energy, surrounding yourself with highly disciplined people essentially lowers the activation energy required for you to act.
How does it lower the barrier?
Because humans are deeply tribal creatures. We want to belong. When everyone around you is rigorously studying or waking up early to exercise or building businesses, the sheer abnormality of not doing those things creates a new kind of cognitive dissonance.
It flips the script.
The path of least resistance actually shifts. It becomes psychologically harder and more uncomfortable to be the only lazy, stagnant person in the room than it is to just join in, push the stalled car, and do the work.
You don't want to be the weak link in the tribe.
Exactly. By intentionally embedding yourself in a community of high performers, and this can absolutely be done virtually through online accountability groups, Discord servers, or language learning partnerships, you are effectively outsourcing a massive portion of your required willpower to your environment.
The group carries you.
The social pressure and the elevated norms of the group carry you forward when your internal motivation inevitably falters.
That brings this entire deep dive full circle beautifully. We started by looking at this murky, confusing landscape of human behavior, trying to find where the magical trait of self-discipline actually lives. And what we have discovered is that it doesn't live in a magical biological reserve of willpower.
Yeah.
It is a distributed, intelligently engineered system.
It is. As we synthesize this entire journey, the ultimate realization is that consistent excellence is not an act of spontaneous, heroic willpower. It is an act of intelligent system design.
Let's recap the architecture we've uncovered. We debunk the motivation myth. We learned that action must come first to spark the momentum. We learned that willpower is not a draining battery, but a capacity shaped entirely by our metacognitive beliefs.
We discover that beating ourselves up after a failure chemically guarantees future failures by triggering stress, and that self-compassion is the true pragmatic engine of rapid recovery.
We explored how to weaponize our own pleasure-seeking tendencies through temptation bundling and how to lock out our future self-sabotage by utilizing commitment devices in a cold, rational state.
We realize that we don't just need to change our superficial goals. We need to change our fundamental identity. We need to cast votes for who we are and build keystone habits that literally upgrade the physical neuroplasticity of our prefrontal cortex.
And when the chaos of life inevitably comes, we defend that new identity with minimal viable practices to keep the streak alive, and we deploy automated if-then implementation intentions to bypass decision fatigue entirely.
And finally, we learned that we have to ruthlessly curate our social environments, because our discipline is only as strong as the network we surround ourselves with.
It is a comprehensive architecture, structuring your environment, your identity, and your network to make the desired behavior simply the path of least resistance. You don't just stand there pushing the stalled car forever. You fix the engine, you build a downhill slope, and you let gravity do the work.
Let gravity do the work. Perfect.
And that leaves us, listener, with one final lingering thought to explore as we close out. We have spent this entire deep dive dissecting how deeply our daily behaviors are influenced by these invisible forces and structures. Our capacity to do hard things is shaped by our internal beliefs, constrained by our physical environment, triggered by automated if-then statements we programmed weeks ago, and heavily swayed by the contagious habits of people who might live hundreds of miles away from us.
It is a vastly complex web of inputs, triggers, and constraints.
So I leave you with this philosophical question to ponder as you go about your day. If our daily self-discipline is entirely shaped by these structural mechanisms, these algorithms we install, and the social secondhand smoke we constantly inhale, to what extent is our so-called free will on a Tuesday morning just an illusion?
Wow.
When you finally sit down to study or go to the gym, are you actually making a heroic choice in that moment, or are you just watching the systems you built flawlessly execute themselves? It's something fascinating to mull over as you begin to design the architecture of your own life.
A truly provocative question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the mind. Keep examining those systems.
Until next time, keep diving deep.